Berlin, April 1945. A city collapsing beneath its own echoes. The rain has turned to ash. Smoke moves like fog through streets where statues wear the soot of the Reich's dying breath. Somewhere beneath the ruins, 24 feet underground. Concrete walls drip with condensation and whispered fear. The war is not just lost, it is rotting in real time. A corridor hums with the dim throb of generators. Their sound is steady, like a dying heart refusing to stop. The floor trembles with every Soviet artillery strike, distant but constant like thunder that refuses to fade. At the far end of the passage, 2 SS guards stand motionless outside a steel door. Behind it sits the man they have sworn to protect with their lives, the man who has dragged a continent into ruin. Inside, Adolf Hitler's hands tremble uncontrollably. The teacup rattles against the saucer as he stares at the map spread across the table, his once unshakable blue eyes reduced to glassy pools of disbelief. The red pins, his armies, are gone. The lines that once stretched to the Atlantic are now splintered fragments clawing toward Berlin from every direction. His empire is a skeleton. He murmurs to himself, lips dry, voice almost childlike. Wenn wir untergehen, dann soll ganz Deutschland mit uns untergehen. If we perish, Germany shall perish with us. His adjutant looks away. Even the guards outside pretend they didn't hear. Because this moment is when faith begins to die. The air in the bunker thickens with the smell of damp concrete, gun oil, and hopeless loyalty. The Führerbunker wasn't built to be a tomb. It was meant to be a refuge, a fortress for command. But by April 1945, it had become the coffin of an empire. The corridors reeked of damp uniforms, candle smoke, and fear. Air was stale, recycled through roaring ventilators that groaned with each power surge. Soldiers joked that the bunker breathed heavier than the Führer himself. Above ground, Berlin was dissolving. Artillery rained from the east, Soviet Katyushas painting the sky in streaks of fire. Whole neighborhoods burned in silence except for the occasional scream carried by the wind. Civilians huddled in subway tunnels clutching suitcases that no longer mattered. The Reichstag's stone lions were pitted by shrapnel, their marble faces disfigured by the weight of history. Down below, in the Führer's bunker, the atmosphere was a theater of denial. Officers in crisp uniforms still saluted, still addressed him as Mein Führer, though their eyes carried a different truth. They whispered about suicides, about surrender, about escape, but never in front of him, never while he could hear. It was 22nd April 1945 when the mood finally cracked. Hitler had gathered his remaining generals in the conference room, Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf, names carved into the final act of this tragedy. The table was littered with maps of armies that no longer existed. He wanted Steiner to counterattack, to strike north and save Berlin. Steiner, the man whose unit was a ghost division on paper, scattered and broken. When news came that Steiner couldn't move, that his forces were gone, Hitler's composure shattered like glass under artillery. He slammed his fist onto the table, veins bulging, spit flying across the maps. Der Angriff Steiners ist nicht erfolgt, he screamed. The attack has not taken place. His voice echoed down the corridor through the steel doors, all the way to the sleeping quarters where guards froze mid-breath. For years they had seen him as invincible, the architect of victories that once redrew Europe. But that night they saw something else, an old man unraveling before their eyes. He ranted for 20 minutes, accusing his generals of betrayal, calling them cowards, incompetents. He shouted that the war was lost, that they had all deceived him. When he collapsed into his chair, gasping, the silence was suffocating. Goebbels stepped forward, tried to console him, whispering of loyalty and destiny, but Hitler waved him off. Ich bleibe in Berlin, he said finally. Ich werde nicht kapitulieren. I will stay in Berlin. I will not surrender. Outside, SS guards exchanged looks. They knew what that meant. No escape, no surrender. Only the final stand. From that day, the bunker changed. The rhythm of life down there became ritualistic. Breakfast at 10, briefings at noon, Goebbels' speeches echoing faintly from a radio that no longer reached the outside world. Eva Braun smoked by the ventilation shaft, staring at photographs of sunny days in Obersalzberg. Secretaries whispered about cyanide capsules, about the smell of gasoline stored near the garage. Every day the ceiling shook a little harder. Every night the lights flickered longer before the generators caught again. Yet inside, orders kept coming. Orders to imaginary divisions, phantom armies that no longer existed. Hitler dictated commands to men already dead, positions already captured. The generals obeyed, pencils scratching obediently on maps as if they could redraw reality through will alone. By the 25th of April, Berlin was fully encircled. The Soviets had closed the ring. The Ninth Army was destroyed. Hitler's world had shrunk to a few concrete rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. But even as shells fell within a few hundred meters, he refused to face the truth. He spoke of miracle weapons, of divisions regrouping, of Wenck's relief army breaking through from the south. The guards began to lose count of the hours. Time dissolved into the dull rhythm of footsteps, shouts, and explosions. Cigarettes became currency, morphine salvation. Some guards began stealing schnapps from the officers' mess. Others wrote farewell letters they would never send. One evening, an adjutant found Hitler standing alone in the map room, staring at nothing. His face was pale, the skin around his eyes swollen from sleeplessness. "Herr Führer," the adjutant began, but Hitler cut him off softly. "Ich weiß, was Sie sagen wollen. I know what you want to say." He turned, voice quiet, almost tender. "Die Deutschen sind es nicht mehr wert. The Germans are no longer worthy." For a long time, no one moved. Then he gave an order that froze every man in the room. He told them to burn everything: documents, maps, correspondence, every trace of what had been. The empire that once prided itself on record-keeping was now ordered to erase itself. Outside the bunker, fires consumed the Reich Chancellery. Inside, the real fire had already started, the slow collapse of faith. The order came without fanfare. No raised voice, no theatrical command. Just a quiet, rasping whisper from a man who had stopped believing in the sound of his own authority. It was the evening of April 27, 1945, when the first of the final directives began to echo through the corridors of the Führerbunker. The city above was gone, a wasteland of flame and rubble. The once proud Reich Chancellery now stood like a cracked mausoleum, its marble halls filled with smoke and ash. Below, in the concrete maze, the soldiers of Hitler's personal guard, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, reduced now to barely 24 men, watched as the last orders of the Reich were spoken. Inside the command room, the light buzzed weakly over Hitler's desk. His face had shriveled into pallor, his left hand trembling violently as he pointed to a map that no longer made sense. "Kampf bis zum letzten Mann," he murmured. "Fight to the last man." He ordered the city to be held street by street, ruin by ruin. Every soldier was to die where he stood. Surrender was betrayal. The men who heard it didn't speak. Their silence was not loyalty anymore, it was survival. They nodded, saluted, turned away. In the corridor, one whispered to another, "He's mad." The other replied, "He was always mad." We were the ones who believed he wasn't. The smell of gasoline drifted through the air. Upstairs, in the ruins of the garden, SS engineers had begun digging shallow pits and stacking cans of petrol. They said it was for security purposes, but everyone knew the truth. The Führer had already ordered preparations for his cremation. The bunker was being turned into both fortress and funeral pyre. Every hour, the sound of artillery grew nearer. The Soviets were closing in from the east, their tanks crawling through the ruins of Friedrichstrasse, their infantry sweeping house to house. The walls shook, dust falling like snow. In the radio room, operators listened to static that used to be communication. No army was left to respond. The 9th Army, 12th Army, Army Group Vistula, names spoken in the bunker like ghosts. At 3 a.m., the guards were ordered to assemble in the lower corridor. SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Günsche, Hitler's personal adjutant, stood before them. His voice was hollow, his eyes bloodshot from days without sleep. "The Führer has new directives," he said quietly. "We are to maintain absolute security. No one leaves the bunker without authorization. Anyone attempting to flee will be shot." Someone asked, "Even civilians?" Günsche hesitated. "Even civilians!" The silence that followed was thick, heavy as the air itself. One of the guards, a 21-year-old from Munich named Erich Bauer, muttered, "We're guarding ghosts." Another spat on the floor and lit a cigarette, shaking. The flame flickered in the stale air. By the afternoon of April 28th, the bunker had descended into delirium. Reports flooded in from above, most of them false, all of them meaningless. One message claimed that Himmler was negotiating with the Western Allies. Another said Göring had declared himself the new Führer. Hitler's rage returned in spasms. He stormed from room to room, his once commanding stride reduced to a limp shuffle. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice rasping like sandpaper.
Verräter!
He shouted, traitors.
Ich hätte sie alle erschießen sollen.
I should have shot them all. He summoned Günsche and Bormann, dictating a new set of orders, his final attempt to control the world from a bunker already entombed by rubble. The SS will maintain order in the capital. Every traitor will be executed. Every deserter shot, his voice faltered. If they come for me, they will not take me alive. The guards outside exchanged looks. Some smirked grimly, others avoided each other's eyes. The myth of invincibility had died, and what remained was a kind of numbness, a hollow loyalty born of fear, not belief. Eva Braun still smiled in the hallways, her laughter oddly bright amid the despair. She had married Hitler the night before, in a brief ceremony witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann. Champagne was poured, though no one drank it. Outside shells whistled and burst. The wedding toast was drowned out by war. She wore a simple blue dress and smelled faintly of perfume, an anachronism in that air of sweat and smoke. Later that night, one guard saw her sitting alone in the corridor, smoking slowly, the ember glowing in the dark. "You're all so young," she said softly. "I suppose none of you ever imagined it would end like this?" The guard didn't answer. She smiled again, almost kindly. Neither did he. On the morning of April 29th, a courier arrived from the front lines. His uniform was soaked in mud and blood, his eyes wide with exhaustion. He brought with him a letter captured from the Allies, a document confirming that Himmler had indeed attempted to negotiate surrender. Hitler read it in silence. Then with a trembling hand he crushed it and threw it into the stove. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The fury was gone. In its place was something worse, calm. He called for his secretaries, Traudl, Junge, and Gerda Christian, and began dictating what he called his political testament. Every word was spoken with icy precision. He blamed the war's outcome on the Jews, the generals, and the cowardice of the people. He appointed new ministers to govern a Reich that no longer existed. His voice didn't tremble once. When he was done, he signed it, the ink blotting on the paper. Then he looked at Günsche and said quietly, "Make the preparations." The guards knew what that meant. Gasoline, blankets, a pistol, cyanide. The end. That evening, as the world above continued to crumble, the bunker fell eerily still. Even the shelling seemed to pause, as if the war itself was holding its breath. In the sleeping quarters, the guards cleaned their weapons methodically, a ritual to silence their thoughts. One of them, a young man from Vienna, opened his prayer book and muttered a psalm his mother had taught him. Another carved his initials into the butt of his rifle. In the adjacent room, Goebbels paced like a trapped animal. His wife Magda sat silently beside a cot where their 6 children slept. She stroked their hair one by one, humming softly. No one knew the melody. When a guard entered to deliver water, she looked up and smiled faintly. "They'll never live in a world without National Socialism," she said. Her eyes were serene, terrifyingly so. The guard backed out without speaking. By nightfall, the air was thick with gasoline fumes. The corridors glistened faintly under the flickering bulbs. Günsche's men carried jerry cans up toward the garden, their boots echoing on the concrete stairs. The odor mixed with sweat and gun oil, making every breath taste metallic. At 10:30 p.m., Hitler emerged from his room. His uniform hung loosely, the fabric creased and stained. Eva walked beside him, her hair neatly brushed, her expression calm. The guard snapped to attention, though none could look him in the eye. He paused at the end of the corridor, turned to Günsche and nodded. "It is time," he said simply. No one followed as he entered his private study. The door closed with a soft click. For several minutes, the bunker was silent. Then a muffled crack. A single shot. When Günsche opened the door, the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Hitler sat slumped on the sofa, a pistol in his right hand, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. Eva Braun lay beside him, her lips blue from cyanide. Her eyes were closed, peaceful. The guards outside didn't move. Some stared blankly, others looked away. One whispered a prayer. Another simply muttered, "It's over." But it wasn't. Not yet. The body was wrapped in a gray blanket, carried up the narrow stairwell by Günsche and 2 SS men. The heat from the burning city poured through the opening as they emerged into the ruins of the garden. Artillery thundered in the distance. Smoke rolled over the cracked pavement. They placed the bodies in the shallow crater near the entrance. Gasoline was poured, thick, glistening, the fumes overpowering. For a moment no one moved. Then Junge struck a match. The flame trembled in the wind, then fell. A sudden roar, a flash of orange in the blackened garden. The fire burned quickly, hungrily, sending greasy black smoke into the sky. The guards stood in silence. The man they had sworn to protect was now ash at their feet. When the flames began to die, they scattered what remained with shovels. Then they retreated back underground, sealing the steel door behind them. Inside, silence returned. The generators hummed. Somewhere, Goebbels began to sob. Somewhere else, Magda Goebbels prepared the cyanide for her children. In the corridor, one guard leaned against the wall and slid to the floor, covering his face with his hands. "All those years," he whispered. For this, outside Berlin burned. Inside, the bunker waited. For surrender, for capture, for nothing at all. And in that waiting, the war's last illusion died. The fire in the garden still burned when the first Soviet shells struck the Reich Chancellery at dawn. Each explosion sent tremors down the bunker walls, shaking dust from the ceiling like snowfall in the dark. The guards had stopped counting the impacts. The world above was no longer measured in streets or districts, but in how far away the next shell landed. By April 30th's end, the Führer was gone. But no one dared say it aloud. In the corridors, they still whispered "Der Führer ruht," the Führer rests, as if the lie itself could hold back the tide outside. The SS guards stood watch at their posts, rifles in hand, waiting for orders that no longer came. The air was suffocating now. Gasoline fumes, sweat, decay. Food had run out. Water came from condensation scraped off pipes. In the sleeping quarters, men stripped down to undershirts, their skin gray from fatigue. Some prayed. Others stared at the walls until their minds slipped into silence. The death of Hitler should have ended everything. But for the SS, it marked only the beginning of a different war. The war within themselves. Otto Junge, still streaked with ash from the cremation, gathered the remaining guards in the lower corridor that night. His voice was hoarse, his uniform stained. "From this moment," he said, "you are free of your oath." The words hung in the air like smoke. For years they had sworn loyalty to one man above all. That oath had been their armor, their identity, their justification. Now in one sentence it was gone, no one spoke. The silence was unbearable. Finally one of the men, Untersturmführer Karl Gebhardt, his face hollow, muttered, "Free? From what? We're buried alive." Junge looked at him, tired. "Then dig yourself out." He turned and walked away, his boots echoing in the corridor. The men were left staring at one another, each seeing the fear reflected in the other's eyes. Above them, the Red Army closed in. Soviet flamethrowers swept the streets. Tanks crushed barricades made of desks and sandbags. Snipers picked off anyone who ran. In the distance, the Brandenburg Gate burned like a black crown. The once mighty SS units defending Berlin were no longer divisions, just scattered pockets of men fighting out of instinct, not orders. At dawn, the first group of SS from the Chancellery Guard tried to break out. They moved through the rubble-strewn tunnels beneath Wilhelmstrasse, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Their goal was the Weidendammer Bridge, where it was rumored a corridor still led west toward the Tiergarten. The streets above were unrecognizable, a wasteland of twisted trams, cratered cobblestones, and corpses half buried in brick dust. Soviet infantry swarmed through the ruins, shouting commands in Russian, their helmets gleaming in the firelight. The SS men crept between shadows, weapons clutched tight, the smell of death in their lungs. One of them, an 18-year-old from Bavaria, named Heinrich Mertens, had never seen combat until now. He carried a Panzerfaust, its metal cold against his back. His hands trembled as he whispered, "Do you think they'll let us through?" The older soldier beside him, a sergeant named Kruger, didn't answer. He was staring at the horizon, where the Soviet flares turned the night red. "There's no through," he said quietly. "Only across." They moved in silence through the ruins. At one corner, they stumbled upon a group of Hitler youth, boys no older than 16, armed with rifles too heavy for their arms. One of them stood beside a wrecked Panther tank, grinning with the delusion of loyalty. "The Führer will send reinforcements," he shouted. Kruger looked at him and said nothing. There was nothing left to send. Minutes later, a shell landed nearby and the world became sound and dust. When Mertens opened his eyes, the boy and the tank were gone, swallowed by rubble. He didn't cry. None of them did anymore. Back in the bunker, time lost meaning. The sound of fighting above grew into a constant roar, as if the city itself were screaming. Goebbels still played the role of minister, dictating propaganda that would never be broadcast. His voice cracked as he proclaimed, "The Führer has fallen a hero's death." No one corrected him. His wife Magda moved like a ghost through the corridors, her face calm and empty. The guards no longer saluted. They spoke in whispers, traded cigarettes, watched the ceiling crumble piece by piece. The myth of the SS, on the Iron Order, the fearless elite, had rotted into disarray. One guard shot himself in the communications room after reading a captured Soviet leaflet, promising mercy to deserters. Another simply walked up the stairs into the flames, choosing open air over suffocation. Those who remained began burning documents by the armload. Files, orders, photographs. Decades of bureaucracy turned to smoke. They were erasing the Reich one page at a time. Junge stood silently by the furnace, watching the papers curl and blacken. His face was unreadable. At one point, Bormann came in, his face pale, his uniform filthy. "We have to get out," he muttered. "There's still a chance through the bridge." Junge didn't answer. His hands were shaking. He'd been awake for 3 days. The bunker had become a tomb, and he knew it. Still, he nodded. "At midnight," he said. "We move." Midnight came. The survivors, Goebbels, his adjutant, a few SS guards, and Bormann, prepared to flee. The corridors glowed faintly from the burning fuel outside. The air was thick, almost liquid with heat. They stepped through the steel door into the night. The garden above was an inferno. The air shimmered with heat, the ground littered with debris and ash. Somewhere beyond the flames, the Soviets were advancing through the Tiergarten, their machine guns crackling like thunder, the group scattered in the chaos. Junge led a handful of men east toward the ruins of the Kaiserhof. Bormann disappeared into the smoke with a radio operator named Axmann. The Goebbels family remained behind, their fate already sealed. In the darkness, the SS men ran through alleys where shadows looked like corpses. Every explosion turned the world white for a second, then back to black. They stumbled over fallen cables through pools of water and blood. One man was hit by shrapnel near Wilhelmplatz. He didn't scream. He just fell, face down, and didn't move again. By dawn, only a few were left. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. The survivors hid in the ruins of a collapsed U-Bahn station, listening to the rumble of Soviet tanks overhead. Mertens clutched his rifle like a talisman. "We should surrender," he whispered. Kruger stared at him, eyes hollow. To who? They both knew the answer didn't matter anymore. At the same hour, below ground, the last moments of the bunker were unfolding. Goebbels, calm and expressionless, poisoned his children while they slept. His wife kissed each one, then bit down on her own cyanide capsule. Goebbels followed soon after. When the guards found them, they didn't react. There were no tears left. The few remaining SS men gathered in the command room one last time. The lights flickered. The radio was dead. Junge stood beside the shattered table, his face streaked with grime. "It's finished," he said simply. "Berlin will fall today." Someone asked, "Well, what do we do?" He looked around the room, his voice barely audible. "Survive." No one saluted. No one spoke. They just turned and left, each man vanishing into the labyrinth of tunnels like rats escaping a sinking ship. By the afternoon of May the 2nd, 1945, the Red Army had reached the Chancellery Garden. Smoke still rose from the crater where Hitler's body had burned. Soviet soldiers moved cautiously, rifles raised. They found the entrance to the bunker half buried in rubble, pried it open, and descended into the darkness. What they discovered wasn't a command post. It was a tomb. The air reeked of gasoline and death. Desks overturned, papers scattered, candles still burning in melted pools. In one room, they found the bodies of Goebbels and his wife. In another, the charred remains of uniforms and medals. The SS were gone. Those who hadn't fled were dead. Above ground, Berlin lay silent under the smoke. The Reichstag, captured and burning, flew the red flag of victory. The streets were littered with helmets, weapons, the fragments of a world that had devoured itself. And beneath it all, The bunker, that fortress of delusion, now stood empty, its corridors echoing with the ghosts of orders that had once ruled millions. In the days that followed, the survivors of the Chancellery Guard were hunted across the ruins. Some were captured and interrogated by the Soviets, forced to recount every minute of those final days. Others vanished into the chaos, changing uniforms, blending with civilians, pretending they had never worn the black of the SS. Heinrich Mertens made it as far as Spandau before being cornered by a Red Army patrol. He dropped his rifle, raised his hands. The Soviet officer stared at him for a long moment, then said simply, "Konez." The end. Mertens nodded. He understood. He had been 17 when he first took the oath. Now at 19, the empire that demanded it was gone, burned to ash in a garden above a bunker that had become the world's deepest grave. The SS had prided itself on obedience, discipline, and fearlessness. In those last hours, none of it mattered. The empire they had served had eaten itself alive, and all that remained were men, young, frightened, and forgotten. For them, survival was not redemption. It was punishment. And somewhere beneath the ruins of Berlin, the bunker still stood, silent and intact, a hollow echo of madness preserved in concrete. The last command had been given. The last bullet fired. The last illusion burned away. The dawn that broke over Berlin on May 2nd, 1945, was not the dawn of peace. It was a dawn of silence, the kind that follows destruction so complete it becomes unnatural. The smoke had settled into the low sky like a bruise. The air stank of ash, blood, and wet brick. Every street was a wound, every building a scar. The war was over, but the city didn't know it yet. When the Soviet artillery finally ceased, the absence of sound was so sudden it felt violent. Men who had fought for days without rest lifted their heads and realized they could hear their own breathing again. Somewhere, a church bell lay shattered in the rubble, its clapper swinging weakly in the wind. In the ruins of Wilhelmstrasse, where the Reich Chancellery once stood, Red Army troops moved cautiously through the smoke. They were young, many barely older than the soldiers they had killed, their faces blackened by soot. They stepped over burned helmets, broken rifles, the still bodies of SS men who had fallen in futile defiance. The black uniforms looked out of place now, like shadows that had outlived their masters. A tank rolled past, its treads grinding glass and bones together in the dust. Above, the red flag hung limp against the skeletal frame of a building that had once housed the Ministry of Propaganda. Its windows were gone, its walls splintered, its marble columns cracked by fire. The streets were filled with echoes, boots on cobblestone, the creak of twisted metal, the murmur of soldiers speaking Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, all languages of victory. Yet behind the triumph was something else, disbelief. None of them had expected to see the Reich's heart like this, not conquered, but self-destroyed. Inside what remained of the Chancellery Garden, Soviet Lieutenant Alexei Spiridonov stood over the crater where the bodies had burned. He was 24 years old, from Smolensk, and had spent 4 years fighting westward across Europe. He had seen villages turned to ashes, cities reduced to rubble. But this was something different. He squatted beside the pit, the air still heavy with the smell of burnt flesh. Pieces of charred bone lay mixed with soil and fabric. He picked up a fragment of metal, a gold button bearing the eagle and swastika, and turned it in his hand. "Führer," a soldier beside him muttered. Spiridonov nodded once quietly. There were no cheers, no laughter, only the sound of the wind scraping through the ruins. For years the name Hitler had been a symbol of fear, hatred, and power. Now it was just smoke in the morning air. A photographer climbed onto a pile of debris, lifted his camera, and took a picture. The pit, the soldiers, the rising smoke. The shutter clicked like a gunshot. History captured its proof in silence. Throughout Berlin, the Red Army fanned out in waves. The battle had lasted 16 days. It ended in less than 16 hours. The last pockets of resistance, Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth, scattered SS remnants, surrendered one by one, hands trembling, eyes blank. Some still clutched Panzerfausts with shaking fingers. Others simply sat in the streets staring at the ground, uniforms torn, boots gone. Civilians emerged slowly from cellars, blinking into daylight. Women carried children wrapped in blankets. Old men leaned on sticks. Their faces were gray with soot and disbelief. They looked at the Soviet soldiers not with defiance, but with a kind of numb exhaustion, a recognition that they had reached the end of something that could not be rebuilt. Spiridonov and his men advanced through the Unter den Linden, past the ruined equestrian statue of Frederick the Great, its horse's head blown off by artillery. The trees were burned down to blackened stumps. Paper drifted through the air like snow, fragments of decrees, photographs, propaganda leaflets, each one a piece of the empire that had collapsed. One of his comrades, Sergeant Mikhailov, picked up a torn portrait of Hitler and held it out. "Look at him now," he said with a smirk. Spiridonov didn't answer. He was looking at the faces of German civilians emerging from the basements, hollow eyes, trembling hands. There was no need for words. By noon, the Soviet command declared the city secured. The red flag waved from the roof of the Reichstag, fluttering weakly in the wind. Below it, bodies lay scattered on the marble steps, Germans, Russians, and those who no longer had sides. The war had reached its absolute zero. Inside the Reichstag, soldiers wandered through the corridors, writing their names in Cyrillic across the walls. Ivan from Kursk, 1945. Sergei from Leningrad. I survived. The marble walls of the Reich's pride became a canvas of survival. Spiridonov followed a small detachment into the building. The floor was covered in rubble, the air thick with dust. A few fires still burned, flickering in the corners like dying candles. In one chamber, they found a table covered in blood and maps, Berlin's final defense plans. Spiridonov brushed away the ashes and saw Hitler's handwriting scrawled across the margins. The ink half burned, but still legible. He stared at it for a long moment. The handwriting of the man who had set the world on fire. Then he folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and said nothing. Outside, the Red Army's field kitchens were already being set up in the streets. The soldiers hadn't eaten properly in days. Some sat on crates sharing bread and vodka with German civilians too shell-shocked to refuse. A strange calm spread over the ruins. The calm of exhaustion, of disbelief. At the same time, other soldiers searched cellars and offices. They found the Goebbels children laid neatly on their beds, their faces peaceful, white ribbons still in their hair. They found the suicide rooms, the cyanide vials, the letters. The soldiers who entered came back pale and silent. One of them whispered, "They killed even the children?" Spiridonov answered quietly, "They killed everything." The words hung in the air like the smoke that still rose from the city's heart. As the sun climbed higher, Berlin's ruins turned silver under the haze. Tanks stood silent at intersections. The only movement came from scavengers and soldiers, civilians, crows. A woman knelt beside the rubble that had once been her home, digging with her bare hands. Nearby, a Russian medic gave water to a wounded German boy. His face half burned, his uniform charred. This was not victory, it was aftermath. News spread quickly through the ranks. Hitler was confirmed dead. Goebbels dead. Himmler captured. Göring in Allied hands. The Third Reich was finished. Spiridonov listened to the announcement on a field radio. The voice reading it sounded almost disbelieving. For years they had marched toward this day through mud, through blood, through endless fire, and now that it had come, it felt weightless, like a shadow passing over an open grave. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking, thin rays of light falling across the ruins. Somewhere far away, someone began to sing, a hoarse voice, half prayer, half lament. Others joined in, their words indistinct, but their emotion clear. It was not joy. It was relief, raw, fragile, almost holy. That night, Berlin glowed under a red sky. Fire still burned in every district. Soviet flares drifted down like dying stars, illuminating the skeletons of buildings. In the distance, artillery thundered one last time before fading into the night. Spiridonov sat on the steps of the Reichstag, smoking in silence. Around him, soldiers slept against walls, their rifles across their knees. The war was over, but no one slept peacefully. Dreams were filled with ghosts. The faces of friends lost from Minsk to Stalingrad, from Kursk to Königsberg. He thought of home, of the river near Smolensk, of his mother's voice. He wondered if she was still alive. For the first time in years, he realized he could go back. And yet part of him knew he never really would. No one came back from this war hole. In the early hours of May 3rd, a drizzle began to fall. It hissed as it touched the embers, turning ash to mud. The city sighed. A slow, heavy exhale after 6 years of burning. Spiridonov walked through the ruins one last time before dawn, his boots sinking in the wet soot. He passed the bunker entrance, now guarded and sealed, its door half buried. He paused, listening. There was no sound. Only dripping water. Only silence. He looked back toward the Reichstag, its broken dome glowing faintly in the mist. The red flag still fluttered there, tattered but defiant. He whispered to himself in Russian, "My zakonchili eto." We finished it, and with that he turned and walked east. His silhouette fading into the gray light of morning, one man among millions, carrying the weight of the war that had devoured a generation. Berlin slept beneath the smoke. The empire was gone. The dawn was red. For the first time in years, the guns stopped. The silence was so vast it felt unnatural, as though the very air had forgotten how to carry sound. Berlin lay beneath a haze of smoke and dawn mist, a city no longer alive but not yet dead. The ruins glistened in the pale morning light, the puddles reflecting the outlines of collapsed buildings and the ghosts of the men who once believed they were immortal. The war had ended, but for those who survived, peace was something they no longer recognized. The Führerbunker, once the beating heart of the Third Reich, now sat like a ruptured organ buried beneath the city's charred skin. Its doors were sealed, its corridors flooded, its walls dripping with the condensation of decay. The Soviets had come and gone, photographing every room, cataloging every inch, every stain, every body. The smell lingered. Gun oil, damp concrete, gasoline, and death. The Red Army had taken the Reichstag, the Chancellery, and every inch of Berlin. What they could not take was the enormity of what had happened there, the weight of millions dead, of a continent ripped apart. That lingered in the air, heavier than smoke. In the days after the surrender, Soviet soldiers roamed the city not as conquerors but as men trying to understand what they had survived. They shared cigarettes with German civilians, gave bread to children who had forgotten what food smelled like. They slept in doorways and cellars, surrounded by ruins that once represented their enemy's pride. One morning, a squad led by Lieutenant Alexei Spiridonov returned to the Chancellery Garden. The fires were long cold now. Only the scorched outlines of the crater remained. Spiridonov lit a cigarette and stared down at the blackened pit. "Zides visio nachalos I zakonchilos zidis." It began here and it ended here. Beside him, a war correspondent set up a camera and began taking photographs, not of soldiers posing in victory, but of silence itself. The frames caught twisted rebar, collapsed walls, helmets half buried in mud. They were not images of triumph, but of the price of it. Somewhere nearby, a child cried. Spiridonov looked up and saw a German boy standing barefoot in the rubble, his clothes torn, his eyes wide with confusion. The lieutenant reached into his pocket, broke his bread ration in half and handed it to him. The boy hesitated, then took it and ran. Spiridonov watched him disappear into the ruins, wondering how many like him would remember this war only through hunger. Across the city, life began to crawl out from beneath the wreckage. Civilians formed lines for water drawn from broken mains. Women swept debris from the thresholds of houses that no longer had roofs. Men pushed carts filled with scrap metal and bones. The Allied radio broadcasts declared, "Germany has capitulated unconditionally," but in Berlin the word capitulated meant nothing. There was no ceremony, no flag of surrender, only the heavy quiet of realization. At night, the city glowed with fires still smoldering in cellars. Soldiers sang softly around makeshift stoves, their voices carrying through the empty streets. Somewhere, a Russian accordion played a sad tune, not of victory, but of remembrance. In the weeks that followed, the bunker became a myth. Soviet officers guarded its entrance, forbidding anyone to enter. Yet rumors spread through the rubble like wind, that Hitler still lived, that his double had died in his place, that he had escaped to Argentina or the Alps. For those who couldn't accept the truth, fantasy became the last refuge. But inside the sealed rooms beneath the garden, the truth remained simple and cold. Charred furniture, broken telephones, a burnt sofa. On one wall, faint pencil markings still read, "Steiner kommt nicht." Steiner is not coming. When the Soviets drained the lower levels, they found personal effects floating in the stagnant water. A woman's shoe, a cigarette case, a half-melted pistol. They took photographs, made sketches, sealed the doors again. The The bunker was no longer a command center. It was a grave without a headstone. By June, Berlin was divided. The city that had once dictated the world's destruction was now quartered among the victors. Soviet flags fluttered over the east, American and British banners over the west. The people moved like ghosts between zones, trading, bartering, searching. Hunger became the new order. Among the survivors were former SS men, now stripped of uniforms, their black insignia burned or buried. They hid among the refugees, pretending to be simple soldiers or displaced civilians. Some were caught and dragged before tribunals. Others vanished into the forests beyond the Elbe, their names swallowed by silence. For men like Heinrich Mertens, who had escaped the bunker's final hours, every day afterward felt unreal. He was found weeks later in a field hospital outside Potsdam, half-starved, his mind fractured. When questioned by a Soviet officer, he simply said, "We were told to guard history." The officer asked, "And where is it now?" Mertens stared through the wall and whispered, "Buried." He would spend the rest of his life trying not to remember. In July, the first Allied journalists were granted access to the ruins. They arrived with notebooks and cameras. Stepping carefully through the scorched garden, they took photographs of the crater, the twisted steel doors, the empty corridors. One correspondent, an American named William Shearer, would later write, "It was not a fortress. It was a tomb of the mind. The world wanted proof of Hitler's death, of the end of the nightmare." The Soviets provided fragments, a jawbone, a piece of skull, the remains of a uniform, but no proof was ever enough. The human mind could not easily believe that such vast destruction could end in such small remains. The photographs were published worldwide, grainy, ghost-like, unreal. In them, Berlin looked less like a city and more like a planet scorched by some otherworldly fire. The years that followed brought reconstruction, then division, then the long shadow of the Cold War. The ruins were cleared, the bunker filled with concrete and rubble. A playground would later stand above it, children's laughter echoing over the buried tomb. The war became a lesson, a documentary, a warning whispered in classrooms and newsreels. But for those who had been there, the memories never hardened into history. Spiridonov, now a veteran back in Smolensk, could still smell the bunker whenever rain hit concrete. Mertens, living under a false name in Munich, still woke at night hearing the echo of a pistol shot through steel doors. The past, they both learned, is not a country that can be left behind. It's a wound that keeps reopening each time silence falls. In 1946, a Soviet archaeological unit returned to the site one final time. The officers entered through a narrow shaft, wading knee-deep in stagnant water. The air was sour, thick with decay. Their lamps cut through the darkness, revealing the collapsed walls, the melted telephones, the remnants of the command table. On one wall, someone had written a final note in chalk. Ende. End. They photographed it, then sealed the bunker for good. Above ground, Berlin was beginning to breathe again. Children played in the ruins. Women hung laundry on wires stretched between shattered facades. The red flag still flew over the Reichstag, though now faded by sun and rain. At dusk, the sky glowed orange through the dust. From somewhere far away came the sound of a train. The first passenger line reopened since the fall. For the first time in months, people were moving not to flee, but to go somewhere. The war was over. The empire was dust. But the silence that followed, that endless, heavy silence, became its truest monument. For silence remembers what men try to forget. And under the earth, deep in the sealed corridors of the Führerbunker, the air still holds the last breath of a dying world, a whisper that history can never erase. Thus ends the 1,000-year Reich.